Rose Sutherland clutched her worn leather satchel to her chest as the stagecoach rattled to a halt in the dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Colorado. It was 1879, and after 3 years of a marriage that had slowly transformed from hopeful to hellish, she had finally gathered the courage to flee from Boston to this frontier mining town where her late aunt had left her a small parcel of land. The journey west had drained nearly all her meager savings, but Rose had calculated it was far enough that Edmund, her husband, wouldn't easily follow. The bruises on her wrists had faded to a sickly yellow during the 2-week journey, but the memory of his fingers digging into her flesh remained as vivid as ever. "End of the line, madam," the driver called, offering a calloused hand to help her down. She winced as her boots hit the hard, packed dirt, her body still aching from the endless jostling of the coach. Copper Ridge sprawled before her, a hodgepodge of wooden structures nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines and the majestic Rocky Mountains. The main street bustled with activity miners with dirt-caked faces, merchants hawking wares, and a few women who looked as out of place as Rose felt in her travel-worn dress. "Need some help with your trunk, madam?" A boy of no more than 12 approached her, eyes bright with the prospect of earning a few coins. "Yes, please," Rose replied, managing a small smile. "I'm looking for Sheriff Miller's office. I was told he might help me locate my property." The boy nodded eagerly, hefting her trunk onto a small cart. "Just down the street past the saloon. Can't miss it." Rose followed him, taking in the sights and sounds of what would now be her home. The town was rougher than she'd imagined, but there was a vibrant energy that Boston's proper society had lacked. Here, perhaps, she could truly start anew. Sheriff Miller proved to be a gruff but kind man who, after examining her papers, directed her to a small cabin on the outskirts of town. "It ain't much," he warned, "but the land's got good water access. Your aunt was a wise woman to claim it when she did." Rose thanked him and arranged for a wagon to take her to the property. By sunset, she stood alone on the porch of a weathered cabin that hadn't seen inhabitants for at least a year. Inside, a layer of dust covered everything, but the structure was sound. A bed frame, table, 2 chairs, and a small cookstove were the only furnishings. As she swept the floor and made the place habitable, Rose allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in years: hope. The next morning, Rose woke with the sun and began the task of turning the cabin into a home. She'd need supplies, seeds for a garden, perhaps some chickens. The small amount of money she had left wouldn't stretch far, but she was determined. In town, she found herself drawn to the general store, where a hand-written sign in the window read, "Help Wanted." The shopkeeper, Mrs. Holloway, was a plump woman with kind eyes who sized Rose up immediately. "You're new, Sutherland's niece." "Yes, madam," Rose replied, surprised at how quickly news traveled. "Heard you moved into Clara's old place. That woman could grow anything in that soil of hers." Mrs. Holloway's eyes twinkled. "You looking for work?" And just like that, Rose secured employment, arranging merchandise, keeping the ledgers, and serving customers. The pay was modest, but it would keep her fed while she established herself. Days turned into weeks as Rose settled into a routine. She worked at the store 6 days a week, using Sundays to tend to her small garden and make improvements to her cabin. She kept to herself mostly, wary of forming too many connections that might somehow lead Edmund to her whereabouts. It was on a warm June morning when she first encountered Keegan Hawkins. He'd ridden into town with a small herd of cattle, a rancher from the North Valley making his monthly supply run. Rose was arranging a display of canned goods when the bell above the door jingled, and he stepped in, removing his hat to reveal sun-streaked brown hair. "Morning," he greeted, nodding to both Rose and Mrs. Holloway. "Got my usual order ready, Beatrice?" "Sure do, Mr. Hawkins, Mrs. Holloway replied cheerfully. "Miss Sutherland here will help you gather everything." Rose moved to assist him, noting his tall frame and the way he carried himself, confident but not imposing. His eyes were a clear blue that reminded her of the mountain lakes she'd glimpsed on her journey west. "Miss Sutherland," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "You're new to these parts." "Yes," she answered simply, passing him the items on his list. "Clara Sutherland's niece." When Rose nodded, he continued, "She was a good woman, helped my mother when times were hard after my father passed. Your aunt had a way with herbs and remedies." Rose felt a pang of sadness. She'd only met her aunt twice, once as a child and once more before her marriage. "I wish I'd known her better," she admitted. They worked through his list methodically, and Rose found herself relaxing in his presence. Unlike many men she'd encountered, Keegan Hawkins didn't leer or talk down to her. He was polite, direct, and there was something in his manner that put her at ease. As he paid for his supplies and loaded them onto his wagon, he paused. "That cabin of yours might need some repairs before winter sets in. The mountain seasons can be harsh." "I'll manage," Rose replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her voice. She'd grown accustomed to doing things on her own. Keegan simply nodded, not pushing further. "If you need help, the Hawkins Ranch is just north, about 5 miles past the creek crossing." With that, he tipped his hat and was gone, leaving Rose with an unexpected sense of loss. It had been a long time since anyone had offered her help without expecting something in return. The summer progressed, and Rose's garden flourished. She became a familiar face in Copper Ridge, gradually allowing herself to form cautious friendships. She still jumped at loud noises and kept her past tightly locked away, but the constant fear began to recede. Keegan Hawkins made his trips to town regularly, and each time he'd exchange a few more words with Rose. She learned he ran his ranch with his younger brother, that they specialized in breeding sturdy horses alongside their cattle operation, and that, despite his reserved demeanor, he was well respected in the community. One sweltering August afternoon, as Rose was closing up the store, Keegan appeared at the door. "Miss Sutherland," he began, twisting his hat in his hands, "I was wondering if you might like to attend the Harvest Festival this Saturday, as my guest." The invitation caught Rose off guard. She hadn't considered the possibility of courting or anything resembling it since her escape. "Mr. Hawkins, just as friends," he quickly clarified, sensing her hesitation. "There'll be music, food. The whole town turns out." Rose considered him for a moment. In the months she'd known him, Keegan had never given her reason to fear him, and perhaps it was time she allowed herself to experience some of the community she'd been keeping at arm's length. "I'd like that," she finally said, surprising herself with the truth of it. The Harvest Festival transformed the main street of Copper Ridge into a vibrant celebration. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, casting a warm glow as the sun set. Tables laden with food lined one side of the street, while a makeshift dance floor occupied the other. Keegan arrived at Rose's cabin promptly, driving a polished buggy pulled by a handsome bay horse. He traded his usual work clothes for a clean shirt and vest, his hair neatly combed. "You look lovely," he said sincerely as Rose emerged in her best dress, a simple blue cotton with lace trim that she'd altered from one of her Boston gowns. The evening unfolded in a blur of introductions, as Keegan proudly presented Rose to friends and neighbors. They shared a meal at one of the long tables, and Rose found herself laughing more than she had in years at the stories Keegan told of life on the ranch. When the fiddlers struck up a lively tune, Keegan extended his hand. "Would you care to dance, Miss Sutherland?" Rose hesitated, then placed her hand in his. "Yes, but I should warn you it's been quite some time. Just follow my lead," he said with a reassuring smile. As they joined the other couples on the dance floor, Rose was acutely aware of Keegan's hand at her waist, strong but gentle, guiding rather than controlling. It was so different from Edmund's grip, which had always felt like a manacle. They danced until Rose's cheeks were flushed and her feet began to ache, and then they walked to the edge of town where they could see the stars more clearly. Under that vast canopy of night sky, Keegan told her about his dreams for his ranch, and Rose shared small glimpses of her life before Copper Ridge, though she carefully omitted any mention of Edmund. When he returned her to her cabin, Keegan gently took her hand and brushed his lips across her knuckles. "Thank you for a wonderful evening, Rose." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "Thank you, Keegan," she replied softly. "I enjoyed myself more than I thought possible." As she watched him drive away, Rose was struck by the realization that something had shifted between them, and more troublingly, something had shifted within her, a wall beginning to crumble. Autumn painted the mountains in fiery hues, and Rose found herself looking forward to Keegan's visits to town with increasing anticipation. They developed a routine. He would complete his business at the various shops, then meet her at the store as she finished her workday. Sometimes they would share a meal at the small restaurant next to the hotel. Other times, they would simply walk together, talking about everything and nothing. One crisp October afternoon, Keegan arrived with an unexpected proposition. "I'd like to show you my ranch," he said as they strolled along the creek that ran behind the town. "Perhaps this Sunday, I could pick you up after church." Rose had been curious about his home, and the invitation felt like another step in their gradually evolving relationship. "I'd like that very much," she replied. Sunday dawned clear and cool. After the church service, Keegan helped Rose into his buggy and they set off north out of town. The journey took them through stunning landscapes of golden aspen groves and vast meadows, until finally they crested a hill and the Hawkins ranch spread before them. It was larger than Rose had imagined, a sturdy two-story house, several barns and outbuildings, corrals filled with horses, and pastures dotted with cattle. Everything spoke of careful management and hard work. "It's beautiful," Rose breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Keegan's younger brother, Patrick, greeted them warmly, and Rose spent a delightful afternoon being shown around the property. Keegan was different here, more relaxed, more animated as he proudly showed her the horses he was breeding and the improvements he was making to the ranch house. As the day waned, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. In that moment, with the scent of pine in the air and the distant lowing of cattle, Rose felt a contentment she had forgotten was possible. "Rose," Keegan said softly, "I know you've been guarded about your past, and I respect that. But I want you to know that whatever brought you to Copper Ridge, I'm glad it did." She turned to look at him, this man who had somehow slipped past her defenses. "Keegan, there are things about me, about my life before, that I'm not proud of. We all have regrets," he replied, "but it's what we do now that defines us." As they rode back to her cabin in the gathering dusk, Rose wrestled with whether to tell him the truth. Would he look at her differently if he knew she was a married woman who had fled her husband? Would the respect in his eyes turn to judgment at her door? Keegan hesitated, then gently cupped her face in his hands. "May I?" he whispered, and when she nodded, he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Later that night, alone in her bed, Rose made a decision. If there was to be anything more between them, Keegan deserved to know the truth. She would tell him everything the next time they met, but fate had other plans. The following Wednesday, as Rose was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store, a familiar voice froze her blood. "There you are, my dear wife." Edmund Sutherland stood before her, impeccably dressed in his traveling suit, looking as coldly handsome as the day she'd married him. Behind him, a hired man loitered nearby, watching with disinterested eyes. How did you find me?" Rose managed, her voice barely a whisper as she gripped the broom handle to steady herself. "Did you think I wouldn't? You're my property, Rose, till death do us part, remember?" Edmund's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now gather your things. We're returning to Boston immediately." "No." The word came out stronger than she expected. "I'm not going back." Edmund's facade of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing the rage beneath. "You don't have a choice. I am your husband and the law is on my side." "Is there a problem here, Mrs.?" Holloway had emerged from the store, her usually cheerful face set in concerned lines. "No problem at all," Edmund replied smoothly. "Just collecting my wayward wife." Mrs. Holloway looked from Edmund to Rose's pale face. "Rose, dear, why don't you go inside and fetch the sheriff's order for us?" Grateful for the excuse, Rose hurried into the store and out the back door. Her mind raced. She needed time to think, to plan. She couldn't go back to Boston, to the prison her marriage had become. Without conscious decision, her feet carried her toward the livery stable. If she could borrow a horse, she might reach Keegan's ranch by nightfall. He would help her, she was certain of it. But Edmund had anticipated her escape. As she rounded the corner of the smithy, his hired man stepped from the shadows, blocking her path. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Sutherland?" he drawled, his hand resting meaningfully on the gun at his hip. Rose backed away, looking frantically for another route, but Edmund appeared behind her. "Really, Rose," he said with exaggerated patience, "this display is beneath you. You're making a spectacle of yourself." He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the same spot they had so many times before, and began dragging her toward the hotel where he'd taken rooms. Rose struggled, but years of intimidation had taught her the futility of physical resistance against his strength. "Let her go." The command cut through the air like a whip crack. Keegan Hawkins sat atop his horse at the end of the alley, his expression thunderous as he dismounted in one fluid motion. Edmund's grip tightened. "This is none of your concern, sir. This woman is my wife, and I'm well within my rights." Keegan advanced slowly, his eyes never leaving Edmund's face. "I don't care what paper you signed or what church you stood in. No man has the right to handle a woman like that." A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Rose felt sick with fear, not for herself now, but for Keegan. Edmund was vindictive and had connections. He could destroy Keegan's reputation, his business, or worse. "Keegan, please," she pleaded. "It's all right. Just go." But Keegan kept coming, stopping only when he was face to face with Edmund. Though they were of similar height, Keegan's years of ranch work had hardened him in ways Edmund's city life had not. "Her husband claimed her like property," Keegan said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "But I'm looking him in the eye and saying she's no man's to own." A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Edmund's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "The law says otherwise, Cowboy. A husband has rights over his wife." "Maybe in Boston," Sheriff Miller's voice joined the fray as he pushed through the onlookers. "But out here, we take a dim view of men who leave marks on women." Rose realized that the sleeve of her dress had been pushed up during the struggle, revealing the fresh bruises Edmund's fingers had just inflicted. The sheriff continued, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Now, Mr. Sutherland, I suggest you unhand the lady and we can discuss this civilly in my office." For a tense moment, Rose thought Edmund might refuse, but he was outnumbered, and beneath his tyrannical nature, he was a coward at heart. He released her arm with a shove that would have sent her sprawling if Keegan hadn't caught her. "This isn't over," Edmund hissed, then straightened his jacket and addressed the sheriff. "Lead the way, Sheriff. I'm sure once we review the legal aspects, you'll see that I'm within my rights to reclaim my wife." As Edmund and the sheriff walked away, Rose sagged against Keegan, the adrenaline draining from her body. "I should have told you," she whispered, tears finally breaking free. "I'm so sorry." Keegan's arms tightened around her. "There's nothing to be sorry for, but we need to talk, and not here." He led her to his horse, and with surprising strength lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. They rode in silence to her cabin, where he helped her down and followed her inside. Once the door closed behind them, Rose's composure crumbled entirely. Between sobs, she told him everything: how she'd married Edmund at 19, thinking she was in love, how his true nature had emerged slowly, first as controlling behavior, then as verbal abuse, and finally as physical violence, how she discovered her aunt's bequest and planned her escape in secret. "I should have filed for divorce before I left," she admitted, "but I was afraid. Afraid he wouldn't allow it, afraid of the scandal, afraid he would find me before I could get away." Keegan listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each revelation. When she finished, he took her hands gently in his. "Rose, listen to me. What he did to you was wrong. No piece of paper gives a man the right to hurt his wife, and I promise you, you're not going back with him." "But the law out here isn't always the same as back east," Keegan said firmly. "And Sheriff Miller is a good man. He won't force you to go with someone who hurts you." As darkness fell, they formulated a plan. Rose would stay at the Hawkins ranch where Edmund couldn't easily reach her, while Keegan and the sheriff would look into legal options to prevent Edmund from forcing her return. The next morning, they rode to town together to meet with Sheriff Miller. To Rose's surprise, Mrs. Holloway and several other townswomen were already at the sheriff's office. "We've been talking sense to the sheriff," Mrs. Holloway explained, patting Rose's hand. "No decent community sends a woman back to be beaten." Sheriff Miller looked uncomfortable but resolute. "I've sent a telegraph to the territorial judge. He's in Denver now but should respond by tomorrow. In the meantime, Mr. Sutherland has been advised to keep his distance." "And if he doesn't?" Keegan asked, his voice hard. The sheriff sighed. "Then we deal with that when it happens. But I've made it clear that Copper Ridge doesn't tolerate men who mistreat women, no matter what the law back east might say." As they left the sheriff's office, Rose spotted Edmund watching from the hotel porch across the street. His cold stare sent a shiver down her spine. "He won't give up easily," she murmured to Keegan. "Neither will we," he replied, guiding her toward his wagon with a protective hand at her back. Life at the Hawkins ranch was a revelation. Keegan's brother Patrick welcomed her warmly, and the ranch hands were respectfully distant. For the first time in years, Rose slept deeply, knowing she was safe. During the day, she helped with household tasks and spent time with the gentle mare Keegan had assigned her. In the evenings, they sat on the porch or by the fire, talking about their hopes and dreams. Despite the cloud hanging over them, Rose found herself falling more deeply in love with this quiet, steadfast man who had stood up for her without hesitation. 3 days after their confrontation with Edmund, Sheriff Miller rode out to the ranch with news. "The judge has replied," he announced, handing a telegram to Keegan. "He says given the evidence of abuse and the fact that Rose has established a life here, Edmund Sutherland has no immediate right to force her return to Boston." Rose felt a wave of relief so profound she had to sit down. There's more, the sheriff continued. The judge is willing to hear a divorce petition when he returns to this district next month. It won't be easy, and Sutherland will likely fight it, but it's possible. Thank you, Sheriff, Keegan said, shaking the man's hand firmly. Don't thank me yet, Miller warned. Sutherland's still in town and he's hired some rough characters. I've told him the judge's decision, but he didn't take it well. Watch yourselves. After the sheriff departed, Keegan doubled the men watching the ranch boundaries. Rose wanted to feel relief, but Edmund's persistence worried her. He had never been one to accept defeat. Her fears proved justified the very next night. Rose was awakened by shouting and the acrid smell of smoke. Rushing to the window, she saw flames leaping from one of the barns. Keegan burst into the room she'd been given. "Stay here," he ordered. "Lock the door behind me." But Rose had lived too long under orders. She quickly dressed and followed him outside where chaos reigned. Ranch hands formed a bucket line from the well to the burning barn, while others tried to calm the panicking horses. Through the smoke and confusion, Rose caught sight of Edmund watching from the edge of the property, his hired men beside him. One held a torch, confirming her worst fears this was no accident. Keegan saw them too. Passing his bucket to another man, he strode toward the interlopers, righteous fury in every line of his body. Rose ran after him, terrified of what might happen. "You've gone too far, Sutherland," Keegan shouted over the roar of the flames. Edmund's smile was cold in the firelight. "I told you this wasn't over. If I can't have what's mine, I'll make sure you have nothing either." One of Edmund's men reached for his gun, but before he could draw, a shot rang out. The man yelped, clutching his arm as blood spread across his sleeve. Patrick Hawkins emerged from the shadows, rifle aimed steadily. "Next one won't be a warning," he called. Edmund's bravado faltered as he realized he was outmatched. The other ranch hands had noticed the confrontation and were moving to surround the intruders, their own weapons drawn. "This is your only chance to leave with your lives," Keegan said evenly. "Take it." For a moment, Rose thought Edmund would refuse. Then, with a look of pure hatred, he backed away. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Rose said, finding her voice at last. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Keegan. "You have no power over me anymore, Edmund. Go back to Boston. The divorce papers will reach you there." Edmund's face contorted with rage, but his men were already retreating, dragging their wounded companion. With a final venomous glare, he followed them into the darkness. The barn couldn't be saved, but thankfully, all the animals had been rescued. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Rose found Keegan sitting on a fallen log, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. She sat beside him, taking his soot-stained hand in hers. "I'm so sorry for bringing this trouble to your door." Keegan turned to her, his eyes intense despite his weariness. "Don't ever apologize for him. None of this is your fault. But your barn can be rebuilt," he finished. "Rose, when I saw that man grab you in town, I knew I'd burn down every building on this ranch myself if it meant keeping you safe." The raw emotion in his voice took her breath away. "Keegan." He took both her hands in his. "I know this isn't the right time. You're still legally tied to him, and there's so much uncertainty ahead. But I need you to know that I love you. I think I've loved you since that first day in the store when you wouldn't accept my help with your cabin." Rose laughed through sudden tears. "I was so determined to be independent." "And you are," he assured her. "That's part of what I love about you. You're the strongest person I know, Rose. Whatever happens with the divorce, whatever Edmund tries next, we'll face it together if that's what you want." "It is," she whispered. "I love you too, Keegan. More than I thought possible." As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the ranch, They shared a kiss that felt like a promise of healing, of hope, of a future where Rose would never again be anyone's property. True to Edmund's nature, he didn't give up easily. Over the following weeks, he made several attempts to undermine Rose's position, sending letters to town council members claiming she was mentally unstable, trying to bribe the sheriff, even threatening the judge. But the community of Copper Ridge had embraced Rose as one of their own and stood firmly behind her. When the judge arrived in early December, the divorce hearing was held in the town hall. Edmund presented himself as the aggrieved husband, painting Rose as an unfaithful wife who had abandoned her duties. But one by one, witnesses came forward. Mrs. Holloway describing Rose's character and work ethic, the town doctor testifying to the bruises he'd observed, and finally, Keegan, who spoke plainly about Edmund's behavior during their confrontation. In the end, the judge granted the divorce, citing cruel and inhuman treatment as grounds. Edmund left Copper Ridge the same day, his final threat to Rose lost in the cheers of the townsfolk who had gathered to support her. That evening, with snow gently falling outside, Keegan and Rose sat before the fire in his ranch house, savoring their hard-won peace. "I have something to ask you," Keegan said, reaching into his pocket. He produced a simple gold ring with a small sapphire that caught the firelight. "It was my mother's. I've been carrying it since the day after the fire, waiting for the right moment." Rose's heart swelled as he dropped to one knee before her. "Rose Sutherland, you came into my life like a wildflower after a long winter. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife not as anyone's possession, but as my equal partner in everything life brings us?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. 1,000 times yes. They were married on New Year's Day, 1880, in a ceremony that the whole town attended. As they spoke their vows, Rose thought of how far she had come from the frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach just months earlier. Spring brought new life to the Hawkins ranch, a rebuilt barn, fields of green, and the news that Rose was expecting their first child. As she and Keegan stood on their porch one evening, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly, Rose reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "What are you thinking about?" Keegan asked, brushing a kiss against her temple. "About how sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you're really looking for," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "And how the bravest thing I ever did was believe I deserved more than just surviving." Keegan's arms tightened around her. "You deserve the world, Rose Hawkins, and I aim to give it to you." As the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, Rose knew with absolute certainty that she was no man's possession. She was a woman who had claimed her own life, and in doing so, had found the truest freedom of all, to love and be loved as an equal.